All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're diving straight into the cold, hard economic logic that took a doomed, swampy island with absolutely zero natural resources and transformed it into a nation with a higher GDP per capita than the US. We're going to explore the actual architecture of a global hub. How exactly does a country with literally no natural advantages manage to engineer its own survival and, honestly, incredible prosperity?
To really appreciate how crazy this transformation is, we have to rewind to 1965. Picture this. The world is watching as Singapore essentially gets kicked out of Malaysia. They are left completely alone. At the time, most experts looking at the situation would have told you this city-state was destined to be just a historical footnote, a failed experiment. I mean, it was an island with no resources, no hinterland to fall back on, and absolutely no clear plan for how they were going to survive the decade, let alone the next century.
And that's what makes the contrast between their impossible starting point and their modern reality so mind-blowing. Think about it, in 1965, this was a nation that couldn't even guarantee a reliable drinking water supply for its own people. Today, they're a massive, wealthy superpower and basically the indispensable gas station for global trade. So how on earth did they bridge that impossible gap?
Well, here is the strict three-part survival blueprint we're going to unpack. We'll start with 1965, a nation doomed. Then, Pillar 1, selling geography. Pillar 2, state-led capitalism. Pillar 3, extreme productivity. And finally, we'll look at the next century's test.
Okay, let's dive into Part 1, 1965, a nation doomed.
To understand the mechanics of this whole economic miracle, you really have to start with their terrifying geopolitical reality. They had zero natural resources, no gold, no oil, literally not even enough water. They completely lacked a hinterland to grow food, and they were dwarfed by these giant, powerful neighbors. To the outside world, their survival didn't just look hard, it looked mathematically impossible.
But, their leadership absolutely refused to accept that fate. Driven by Lee Kuan Yew, they looked at this dire situation and made this incredibly cold-blooded vow to survive. They figured out a very simple truth. If you have absolutely nothing to sell, you have to completely rewrite the rules of the game.
Which brings us to Pillar 1, selling geography.
So if you can't dig wealth out of the ground, where do you get it? Their answer was what we call the logic of the port. The leadership realized that for trade between massive markets like China and Europe to actually be profitable, those giant cargo ships desperately needed a mandatory place to stop, refuel, and get repaired. Singapore didn't have a drop of their own oil, but they capitalized perfectly on that exact geographic need along global shipping routes.
You can basically sum up their genius in one simple mantra: sell the world its own geography. If you've got nothing else, you take your physical location on the map and make it an absolute geographic necessity for everyone else. They recognized that their position on the globe was their single greatest asset.
And they didn't just stumble into this either. They actively modeled their strategy after Japanese and Dutch trade wealth. By building a flawless, Dutch-style engineering marvel, meaning it was heavily automated, crazy fast, and just ruthlessly efficient, they made their infrastructure the absolute best in the East. They basically forced the world's massive economic engines to flow right through their front door, turning themselves into the indispensable gas station of global trade.
All right, let's move on to Pillar 2, state-led capitalism.
Now, just having a great port doesn't automatically make your everyday citizens wealthy, right? You need a machine to actually capture and grow that wealth internally. At the time, a lot of developing nations were terrified that open trade would just lead to a new kind of colonization, so they closed their doors to protect their fragile industries. But Singapore, they took a totally different approach. They realized that shutting your doors just locks you in a room with your own poverty. So instead, they fully embraced extreme trade openness, with the government taking a very, very hands-on role.
Rather than sitting back and crossing their fingers that private businesses would figure it out, the government itself stepped up to act as the ultimate entrepreneur. Think of them like a massive national venture capital firm. They literally took the nation's savings and strategically handpicked specific, high-potential industries to aggressively fund and support.
They heavily studied how Japan and South Korea built these massive, state-backed corporate giants. Emulating that success, Singapore poured investments into their own hand-picked mascot companies. But here is the catch. There were absolutely no handouts for failure. They essentially forced these industries to become world-class or face immediate consequences. They relied strictly on the economic rule of comparative advantage, meaning you ruthlessly master only the very specific things you're naturally positioned to do well.
Next up is Pillar 3, extreme productivity.
This is a point that honestly surprises a lot of people. While countries like the Nordics were building these massive social safety nets to encourage people to take entrepreneurial risks, Singapore knew they had a totally different reality. They had to squeeze every ounce of maximum value out of their human capital. So they invested heavily, and I mean aggressively, in the single resource they actually had, their people.
They approach this with a super strict survivalist mindset. Step 1, ruthlessly simplify the national education system. Step 2, funnel those students directly into engineering and high-tech skills. And Step 3, ensure that every single worker creates massive technological value. The whole goal here was to make one highly educated Singaporean worker equal to 1,000 manual laborers somewhere else.
Which leads us to our final section, the next century's test. Can this miracle actually last?
Look, with those three pillars, selling geography, state-led capitalism, and extreme productivity, Singapore completely bypassed the economic stagnation that traps so many others. But if you look at the current data, the challenges are really mounting. The foundational one-man narrative of Lee Kuan Yew is slowly fading into history. Their domestic population is rapidly aging, and global trade routes, they're constantly shifting. Without a massive injection of new ideas, they run a very real risk of stagnating into a sick dog of the global economy. It just goes to show that economic survival is a continuous, never-ending test.
And that brings us to the end of our analysis. I want to leave you with one final, pretty profound question to chew on. Is this Singapore model, this super unique blend of strict government control, hyper-efficiency, and a total survivalist mindset, really the absolute best blueprint for a developing nation trying to rise out of poverty? Or is this just a highly specific system that only works on a tiny, geographically blessed island? It is a fascinating debate. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the architecture of the world around us.